cleanup of environmental hazards at the Department of Energy's Oak Ridge site is an issue that affects us all. DOE is working to address the issue, but it needs citizen input. One way you can help is to take part in the meetings of the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board, a volunteer citizens panel. By attending meetings, you can learn about the cleanup program and voice your opinions. Join us in making our area an even better place to live. For more information, call toll-free or visit us online.
I'd like to start off by welcoming members of the public.
Excuse us.
I'd like to remind everybody to please, the visitors, to please use, this isn't starting off well, to please wear your name tag and speak into the microphone when you have a comment. I'd like to remind the members of the board to also use your microphones, and please use your name tags to be recognized. During the question and answer period, board questions and comments from board members will be taken first and then the public. Our next meeting will be May 9th, and the presentation will be an overview of the Federal Advisory Committee Act by the SSAB's designated federal officer, Kate Alexander. Later in the evening, we will have an update on the U-233 project given by John Kruger. For now, we will go on into item number 2, and we'll take comments from our Sue Caines is running a little late, but she will be here, so we'll start off.
Yeah,
Dave Adler.
I expect Sue will be here in a little bit. She was back in the federal building and was being held over by a meeting with upper-level folk from Washington. Two things I wanted to mention. One is that we've had a new development in our effort to develop an approach for historical preservation at the East Tennessee Technology Park, otherwise known as K25. You've heard what our proposal is enough that I don't think I need to repeat it. I will summarize it very briefly. Our proposal was to pull down the buildings for the most part, and then to create some on-site facilities to display the technology that was used at the site to enrich uranium, and then to preserve the original footprint of the facility, and to build a tower to allow visitors to oversee that footprint, and a few other interpretive facilities involving virtual museums and things of that sort. About a $10 million proposal on DOE's part. About 2 months ago, the National Park Service was asked to give their opinion of the department's proposed approach for managing the site and the historical commemoration activities out there. They just issued their report. It came in a week ago Friday, and their recommendation is actually to preserve a component of the North Tower. So that's a bit of a twist, because we do have now the nation's, the National Park Service, who specializes in commemorating and historical interpretation and all that good stuff, making a recommendation that a portion of the North Tower be preserved. They actually list 3 different approaches. The one they prefer is to preserve the circumference, the original walls of the North Tower, and then about 1/12 of the process gas technology that's contained in that building. So we've done some quick cost estimates on what it would cost to do that. It would be very, very expensive. It would easily treble or quadruple or possibly even more the approach to preservation measures out of the site. So we're working through that. We want to make sure that we don't get out ahead of the Park Service recommendation, or that we're well coordinated with headquarters and all the other groups that have a stake in this matter. But it is a significant new development, and stay tuned. There'll be more to talk about over the next few weeks. As I mentioned, we just got the information about a week ago. We haven't really figured out what our precise response will be. Any questions on that one before I move on to the next one? Yes.
Yeah, are they going to take over the facility if you preserve it?
That's a good question. The Park Service has just completed a study on the feasibility of creating a new element of the National Park System to commemorate the history of the Manhattan Project at large. not just Oak Ridge, but Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Hanford, and some odds and ends. So they were asked by Congress to look at the value/feasibility of creating such a historical park. As you're probably aware, they have natural parks and historical parks. And they came back and recommended in their study that such a park be created, and that the park have separate components in the three primary sites, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. In that recommendation, they did not specifically recommend that the K-25 building be retained. They did recommend that the Calutrons, or the beta racetracks at Y-12, be retained, and the graphite reactor at Ornell be retained, but they didn't specifically recommend that the K-25 building be preserved. So, what happens next is legislation would have to be drafted by and passed by Congress, directing the Park Service to create a park, and legislation would have to be drafted and approved funding the Park Service to do whatever they ask them to do. So there still are a few significant steps before this park idea could become reality. But it has some wings now because the Park Service has recommended it. Different groups are drafting competing legislative language to get the park created, and that's kind of happening. Whether or not the Park Service would own ETTP is unclear. The general concept is that the Park Service would do what they do best, which is interpretation. They'd have a couple of rangers here who would be the historians who would help visitors understand and benefit from visits to the park. DOE would probably retain ownership of all the facilities that made up the park. So DOE's contribution would be to own, maintain, provide access, security, health and safety type arrangements for visitors to the facilities. And the Park Service would be responsible for basically being the tour guide to the facilities. So the cost would be borne by DOE primarily. Any other questions on this one? Yes, Steve.
As everybody knows, the Site-Specific Advisory Board has provided at least opinions and recommendations on this whole issue for the last couple of years. Is there anything in your mind that we can do as a group at this point to help facilitate the decision process? Or is this so far beyond us at this point that it is fruitless?
Well, I think you've already done most of what you can do. As Steve, you may be aware, and I think the Site-Specific Advisory Board was a part of this, but a consensus opinion was offered by all of the what are called consulting parties in the process to develop this plan. So we have, in effect, a letter from the City of Oak Ridge, the East Tennessee Historical Preservation Alliance, the Oak Ridge Historic Preservation Association, a collection of groups who have an interest in the site, who have all tendered their basically support for the plan that DOE had offered. So one thing we had already accomplished is to build a local consensus on how to proceed. Those groups have been with it for a long time and are very familiar with all of the considerations that have gone into this, all the cost considerations in particular. The Park Service really wasn't asked to worry the cost issue. They're simply asked, what would be the best way of allowing future visitors to understand and interpret the North Tower or the K-25 building? And they answered it. Their report doesn't speak to cost considerations at all. So I think what we need to do is to basically accept their report and graciously respond to it. And if our decision is to stay by the current proposal, then we will offer our logic for doing that. If the decision is to switch, then we'll have to come up with some rationale for that and a fair amount of money. I won't speculate. Let's see how it unfolds. For now, I'd say stay tuned. It's possible that we will hold one more consultation because this is a significant new development. It's possible we'll hold one more round of consultations with all the people who've been involved in this effort for so long. It really is time to go ahead and make a decision, move on. But if we do that, certainly we'd want the Site-Specific Advisory Board to participate in that as they have in past meetings. Scott.
I just have a quick comment and then a question, but the comment is I think that's an outstanding development. I was disappointed that there was a perceived trade-off of the Alexander N with the K-25, some remnant thereof, and I think that's outstanding. To Steve's point, anything that we can do, I think that's a very positive thing. So the question involves, there's been so much talk about ETTP and the pace of demolition, et cetera. So the obvious question is, what now? Is this going to be another wait for the Park Service and all that process, so ETP is never going to come down, or are we going to continue to dance?
All our efforts will be focused on ensuring that there's minimal or zero disruption of the efficiency of our D&D activities at ETTP. We don't want to have to lay off workers while we sit and wait for decisions. We don't want to make the progress less efficient. We do have a little time to work through this. This doesn't begin to impact us immediately, but it would over the next, certainly, weeks to months. We need to either be moving into demolition of the North Tower in late summer or have an orderly, predetermined shift to some other focus of work, be it K-27 or some other big building that we're tearing down. We need to get a decision on what we're going to do well in advance, or somewhat in advance of August, so that we can not have a disrupted workflow. We have a little bit of time. It's not a crisis.
Thank you. Any more questions for Dave?
I had one other thing I just wanted to mention. It's very brief. We now have an expectation that some of the money provided by the President's stimulus program, the ARA, you've heard us talk about a lot, we've rounded up how much, we've basically executed most of the work that we plan to do with those stimulus monies. We have had some underruns, and we've been using those underruns to fund additional work. You've heard us use the term buyback work. That's basically our ability to add additional projects because some of the projects went well, or some projects got canceled and that freed up money. It now looks like we will have about $22, $23 million to begin some meaningful mercury abatement projects at Y-12. So, although we're working with John and his group and EPA, it looks like we're going to try to design and build a water treatment plant for the water that leaves that site so as to bring mercury levels down. That's good news environmentally. It's a challenge because we don't have a lot of time to spend down the ARA money. There are actually time constraints on how long we can spending that money. So we got to get it spent. We got to get it spent intelligently, safely, and with a good outcome. But it looks like the best idea on the table right now is to spend it on some mercury abatement activities at Y-12. So we'll be talking more about that over the next couple months.
Great.
And that's it for me.
Any more questions? Okay, let's move on to our EPA liaison, Connie Jones.
Thank you. I don't have any announcements to make at this time, but I'll be more than happy to attempt to answer questions if asked. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Connie. Let's move on to our TDEC representative, John Ounsley.
Thank you, ma'am, and I too have no announcements, but would be glad to answer any questions the board may have. Please, yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Speaking on your time here, but this is open to everybody. There was going to be a group gotten together to look at what we can do short term on some of the EM issues that are not going to be closed out as soon as we thought they would be closed out. Has this group gotten formed up yet?
We have been working diligently with EPA and the Department of Energy to resolve our differences in 12 and 13 to prepare for a FY 2014 budget request. And we have been working and, at least from TDEC's perspective, have a reasonable position to carry forward for, again, the fiscal years of 12, the one we're in, 13, the one that's coming up, and 14, the one we're planning for. We still have a ways to go to get from 14 or 15 through completion, but we feel confident we can get through 14. So if that's what you're referring to, I think that has occurred. It has occurred at the FFA project team and supervisory management team level, and those are standing groups that work all the time. They're not a specially assigned group. So if there's a specially assigned group that's supposed to be doing something, I'm not aware of it, or I'm not answering your question.
I may not be answering your question either, but I'll try. We have worked very hard over the past few months to, and it's been a give and take process, to re-rack the sequencing of work, particularly over the next, 3 to 10 years, to make sure that we get a blend of ETTP tear down and mercury mitigation and national lab, old building and nuclear materials disposition that optimizes all sides' respective interests. And I'm totally in agreement with John. I think we really come pretty close to having pulled that off now, at least for the next few years. And we've done it under budget assumptions that are realistic, that basically assume that we can sustain the funding levels that we've enjoyed in FY12 and plan out from there. So
You'd set a pretty stiff schedule for yourself on when you were talking about it, and I'm glad to see that you're able to follow through on that.
Go ahead.
But just to follow up on that, Dave, you mentioned y'all were working hard on that particular issue as it relates to the budget. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because we're going to be looking at that recommendation tonight. And based on your conversations and your look at our recommendation, I seem to think that we're pretty right on with that recommendation. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to get your feedback on that.
yeah, I agree. As you know, I've participated or observed your development of that recommendation, and I think it's right in sync with the approach that DOE, EPA, and TDEC have been promoting. So we're beginning to speak, I think, with one voice from East Tennessee on budget and budget prioritization. That's always a good thing when it comes to making your case.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? All right. Let's move on to our public comment period, and we'll open up with Casey McMaster.
The public comment period is now open. Norman Mulvaney.
My name is Norman Mulvaney. I'm currently the vice chair of the Citizens OP. Oversight panel, that's right. There we go. Thank you, John.
We're kindred spirits in the oversight business.
We're the Citizens Oversight Panel, and our chair is not here this evening. He has a problem. His wife works for the feds, and she's on travel, and he has to do the babysitting. So I am a little bit surprised about the event with the National Park Service, but again, I'm very pleased that they're here. And it sounds like we all have a goal to work forward. The other thing is that I think that tonight's recommendation is going to be very important. I encourage everybody to look at it very carefully. There's some funny wording in it that I didn't particularly understand, and I'd like to be sure that's clarified. And I guess that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public who wish to speak? All right. As a Citizens Advisory Board to the Department of Energy on environmental cleanup, we want to encourage the community at large to attend and participate at our board and committee meetings. If you are unable to attend, please send in your questions and comments to the address shown. Appropriate comments and questions will be read during the public comment section of the SSAB meeting and will be given the same consideration by the board and DOE as those given in person. Meeting schedules and various ways to communicate with the ORSSAB can be obtained by calling 241-4583 or 241-4584 or by visiting our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. If there are no further comments, we'll move on to the presentation portion of our meeting. Start out with Mr. John Kruger. John is on loan from Oak Ridge National Laboratory to the DOE Oak Ridge office under the Intergovernmental Personnel Act. He has 25 years of experience in environmental and waste management program and project management and has served as Senior Program Director for the Integrated Facilities Disposition Program and Waste Management Operations at the Y-12 National Security Complex. As a Federal Project Director for the U-233 Disposition Project, John is responsible for planning and executing the disposition of excess U-233 from Building 3019, preparing the building for demolition, and ongoing safe and secure operations and maintenance.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening. I'm here to give you an update on the uranium-233 disposition program, and I think it's been a while. I think it may have been May. Was it May of last year that I was last here? And I wouldn't be surprised if a fairly significant number of people in here weren't participants at that time. So I'm going to start with some fairly general overview type stuff and bring everybody back up to speed on what we're doing out at ORNL for uranium-233 disposition. But first I want to talk a little bit about what uranium-233 really is. It's created in reactors by irradiating thorium-232. It was used to study the thorium fuel cycle back in the late 50s and also as a potential bomb-making material because it is a fissile material like plutonium-239 and uranium-235, which are the only other two isotopes. It was studied because thorium-232 is ubiquitous. It's throughout the soil. It's very commonly found, so it was a possible good replacement for uranium-235 when 235 they thought was going to start running out. It's an alpha emitter, much like plutonium and uranium, but it has a decay chain that includes thorium-229, which is of interest to the medical isotope field. You've probably heard about that in the past. Because of the way that it's made, yeah, this does work up here, by irradiating thorium-232, you always make some uranium-232 along with the uranium-233. And so, depending on the neutron energies and the duration of the irradiation, you have different concentrations of uranium-232 that always contaminate, so to speak, the uranium-233 that you're really trying to make. And the reason that's important is because inside the decay chain of uranium-232 is thallium-208, which is a high-energy gamma emitter. And so all the material that we deal with is pretty hot. It's generally remote handled. Some of it's pretty high dose. So you have to be very careful. It's not only an inhalation dose because of the alpha emission, it's also a direct penetrating radiation dose. So it's pretty difficult and challenging material to deal with. It also happens to emit radon-220, or more commonly known as thoron. It's a gas at standard temperature and pressure, and it has a pretty fast half-life, so you can actually engineer systems to get it out because it decays to a particulate and you can filter it. But you nevertheless have to engineer your systems such that you have enough delay time in your ventilation systems and you can filter out the thoron. Otherwise, you'd end up with significant doses to people. So it's a challenging material, and it has quite a history at ORNL. Building 3019, where our excess uranium-233 is now stored, was constructed clear back in 1943, right adjacent to the old graphite reactor. So it was the building itself, which is here in this slide. This is the building we're talking about, and here's the old graphite reactor. The building was constructed as a pilot plant for the extraction of plutonium. So they studied how to best and efficiently extract plutonium. So some of the old processes you've probably read about, like Purex and Thorex and the old bismuth phosphate process, all those were piloted at a small scale inside of Building 3019. But its mission changed over time, and eventually, because of its very robust structure and because of the hot cells that it was built around, the hot cells are in this area. There's about 7 of them, very, very robust, thick walls, heavy ceilings and floors. Because of those hot cells, DOE recognized it would be an ideal place to store this excess uranium-233 for potential future programmatic uses. So they began consolidating the uranium-233 inventory in about 1962 and bringing it to Building 3019. So that's where the inventory has been ever since. Now Building 3019 is the oldest operating nuclear facility in the world because the nuclear era started here, and it was built at the very beginning in 1943. And it's still operating because it's actively storing this uranium-233 in a safe and secure manner. But in about 2000, I believe it was, there was a workshop in which DOE invited a bunch of potential stakeholders for this material and decided that there was really no future programmatic use, and they essentially declared it as excess to national security needs and other programmatic needs. And so in 2001, a decision memorandum was signed, and they decided that the only real use for this material was potentially as a source of medical isotopes, that thorium-229 decay chain that I was mentioning earlier. So in 2003, a contract was let to Isotech to extract the thorium decay chain so that it could be milked for medical isotopes, actinium-225 and bismuth-213, over time, and then take the inventory. And the way you do that is you dissolve it all, you extract it with an ion exchange column, and you put the thorium back in, you put the thorium aside and you milk it over time, and then you run the uranium back into storage after it's in a much more stable form. So the beauty of it is that you would end up with some feed material for medical isotopes, and you would end up with a more stable uranium inventory, U-233 inventory, addressing an issue that was brought up just prior to that decision. And the issue was brought up by the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board in 1997 when they looked at storage configurations like the one at Building 3019 and questioned its long-term stability. Let's talk a little bit about that inventory here. So the inventory now contains about 1,100 canisters of different physical and chemical forms of uranium-233. And they're literally in hot cells or in the hot cell wall between the cell area that was formerly used for processing studies. So there are tube vaults that were lowered into the upper hatch in one of the vaults, and then there are holes that are drilled into the walls in between. And inside you'll see stacked little canisters of various sizes of different kinds of chemical and physical forms of U-233. 3 stories tall in some cases, so you could have like over 30 canisters in a single well, for example. And obviously an array like that is not inspectable, and it's been in there since 1962. You can imagine it's very secure because it's a fissile material, so it's extremely expensive to get in and out of a vault like that. And so it's not a routine inspection sort of situation. Defense Board became concerned about the potential for decay of those materials over time, or the canisters. And so they issued a recommendation back to DOE in 1997 to stabilize or inspect the inventory. And that shortly thereafter, DOE decided, we'll start the inspection, but about halfway through they decided it'd be better just to dispose of the inventory. So the inspection program started. They looked at Ornell. They looked at samples of canisters from each of the different chemical and physical types. And then they kind of cut it off and said, well, that's a pretty good sampling. It shows that it's really not decaying too much. It's in pretty good shape. And we're going to dispose of it anyway, so let's just do that. And so DNFSB recognized that the contract had been let in 2003, that the material was going to be extracted and then stabilized, and they were comfortable that the inventory would ultimately be safe as a result of that. So that became the early mission of the U-233 disposition program. Take the entire inventory, no matter what the form, dissolve it in concentrated nitric, extract it for the thorium-229 decay chain, and then stabilize it, solidify it or something, and put it back into storage for some indeterminate amount of time, probably right back into 3019. Now, going back to the inventory, here for a second, is quite heterogeneous. So it is a challenge to do even the scope of work I talked about, because you have different kinds of canisters, different kinds of sealing, so you have to cut some open, you can unscrew others. You have different chemical and physical types in there. There's a whole body of material called the Consolidated Edison Uranium Solidification Project material. These are U3O8 monoliths that are, and they are found in these canisters here. And they're bound to the inside of the container, so they're really hard to get out. And they're really quite a stable form of the uranium. So they're much more difficult to deal with than, say, a powder that might be found in a can like this that you can just dump out and dissolve. So it's quite a broad range of different kinds of materials. We have the molten salt reactor experiment traps, which are sodium fluoride pellets with absorbed uranium hexafluoride that came from the molten salt reactor. A large number of oxide powders that I was talking about a minute ago. A few metals canisters, about 128 of these zero power reactor plate canisters, which I'll talk about more later. And then a couple of cats and dogs, uranium fluoride salts, basically. I mentioned that the doses can be pretty high. Here's the dose range that you see off these canisters, 1 to 300 R. And as I mentioned, a lot of the material of 403 of the 1,100 canisters are these cusp canisters. They're on the 300 R per hour side of that spectrum. So there's a pretty hot series of canisters to deal with here, even though it's a very physically and chemically stable form of the uranium. So quite a challenge to deal with this material. And it so happened that the mission changed as well in the meantime. So Isotech was off and running on the design for that dissolution and extraction process. And then in 2005, Congress said, we're really not interested in the medical isotope scope of work anymore. And so they transferred responsibility for the project from the Office of Nuclear Energy to the Office of Environmental Management and said it's really now a waste management mission. We don't want you to extract the thorium. We want you to deal with this material, make it disposable, and dispose of it as a waste. And so the whole design basis changed, and ultimately the end product had to be redesigned, and the process for getting to the end product had to be redesigned. And on top of that, a lot of different design challenges emerged. As I mentioned, Building 3019 is the oldest nuclear facility in the world. It was not intended for this kind of processing, and yet the design was intending to backfit this facility built to old standards, 1943, so that it could process safely this challenging material to today's standards. So you can imagine the challenge associated with that, with retrofitting that kind of a facility to do that kind of thing. And various challenges emerged throughout the entire process. It turned out that there was a lower concentration of transuranic materials in some of it, so the ultimate destination of the material changed from WIPP to the Nevada Nuclear or National Security Site, and that changed the end product design again. So challenge after challenge after challenge emerged as the design matured, and ultimately the cost of this project kept growing, both the design cost and the projected construction cost to modify Building 3019, and it turned out to build an adjacent annex to solidify the downblended uranium and ultimately make it acceptable as a waste. So we got to a point where we were projecting a pretty high cost to the Deputy Secretary of Energy to complete this project, much, much higher than it was ever baselined. And about, I guess it was 7 years into this thing, the question started coming up, are we really going down the right pathway here? Or should we be looking at perhaps an alternative approach, given that certain circumstances had changed over time? The thing started, the decision was made clear back in 2000. Here we were in 2010 talking to the Deputy Secretary about a $600 million price tag on this job. And so the Deputy Secretary ultimately endorsed the concept of an alternatives analysis even this late in the game. Now the design wasn't complete yet, so we still had the opportunity to avoid a lot of cost. And so the decision was made to take another look at whether or not this is the right path forward. And in 2010, we kicked off a phase 1 alternatives analysis. And that was just to screen all the different potential alternatives to dispositioning this material. And we published a final draft of that study in January of 2011. And it turned out that, yes, indeed, there is another way. Rather than sort of brute force all of the material, regardless of its nature, through a single technique where you're having to cut it all open inside of Building 3019, dissolve and downblend, it turned out that in 2006 through 2008, new programmatic demands for some of this material emerged that weren't known back in 2003 when the contract was first let. It turned out that new facilities came online in that intervening time. For example, the TWPC, the Transuranic Waste Processing Center at Oak Ridge, came online. The device assembly facility in Nevada and its critical experiments facility came online. All those facilities didn't exist clear back when we were first considering this project. So in consideration of those changed circumstances, other changed circumstances, and the cost growth of this project, it became attractive to try another route. And what we recommended was basically two different techniques for disposing of the inventory. One is called direct disposition, and you'll hear me call it the direct disposition campaign. And it has two components. The first component is a simple transfer of materials that are of high value to other programs, as it turns out. And that's simple. I mean, all we have to do is take it out of inventory and ship it. So that's quite cheap. The second component is a little bit more challenging, and it involves a direct disposal without any processing of that cusp element. Recall that I mentioned that there's about 403 of those, so that's 37% of the inventory. And that form is it's U3O8, it's the most chemically stable form of uranium. And it's in a very solid monolith that's insoluble. So, and it's inside of these 4-inch canisters where it's basically bonded to the internals. So it's very stable as a waste form, and actually it hit the phase 1 team that it really would be an ideal waste form to dispose of. So we talked to Nevada, we got them engaged, and it turns out that they accept the idea of having this material go out for direct disposal at the Nevada National Security Site without any processing. So we're still working through the details on that, but that's the second component of the direct disposition campaign. The third involves processing of the remaining inventory because it cannot be either transferred or disposed directly. So there is still some processing. And the goal of that processing ends up being driving the U-233 concentration down below criticality safety concerns and down below security concerns. Those end up being your two biggest drivers. So what we end up doing is dissolving it and then downblending it with depleted uranium so that it can be disposed of safely. Now, what's the difference between that and the original approach? Well, we took a look at where it would be best to do this. And in the phase 1, we concluded that what we ought to do is go ahead and use the design that had been nearly completed for dissolution and downblending in 3019, and then send that downblended material to the TWPC, rather than solidifying it in a brand new annex built next to the 3019 building. So that way we could avoid all that new construction cost. We could co-process this material with existing wastes at the Transuranic Waste Processing Center and avoid all of the construction, all the second half of the processing, and all the transportation and disposal costs that we would have to pay for separately if we weren't co-processing with the Melton Valley storage tank sludges. So that was sort of the conclusion of phase 1. And by virtue of doing those two things, it eliminated by direct disposition half the inventory without any processing. So it either goes direct to other programs or it goes to the landfill, half of it. But the beauty of it is when you do this, you not only get rid of 52% of the canisters, you get rid of 75 to 77% of the total uranium. And 85% of that troublesome uranium-232 isotope that causes the heavy dose. So it makes processing of the second half of the inventory a little easier to deal with. So that was a side benefit of the solution in the phase 1 analysis. And then we are going to co-process the remaining inventory at TWPC, as I mentioned. Ultimately, that alternative reduces waste volume, it reduces processing time because you're only processing half the inventory, reduces transportation, it's safer because you don't have as much worker exposure, you're not processing as much, and it allows EM to address other important environmental issues sooner. Why? Because we save money that can be plowed into other EM projects. So where are we with that? We published that report in January of 2011. In April of 2011, we got a letter from the Deputy Secretary of Energy saying go with the direct disposition campaign, and saying, but we want you to do a phase 2 analysis to get into a little bit more detail on the processing of the second half of the inventory. Because we recommended that we needed to really dive down deep and make sure that we had uncovered every stone on that one. So we did that. We went forward with Isotech to execute the direct disposition campaign, and we modified the contract, and Isotech, to their credit, agreed to a fixed price modification to the contract option that allowed for direct disposition. So they are now under essentially a lump sum commitment to us to get rid of half the inventory. So that really gets things driving forward, and it really has done so. The first piece of that are the transfers of the programmatic materials that are interesting to other programs. And the biggest piece of that are these zipper plates, the ones I mentioned earlier, zero power reactor plates. There's about 128 of those canisters. And we're going to complete the shipments in about 26 shipments to the device assembly facility in Nevada, that new facility I talked about. So far to date, and by the way, also to Isotech's credit, we had the approval to go forward in April. By December, we were shipping. And that's taking Billing 3019 from a standby mode to a full operational mode where we're extracting containers, loading them up into Type B containers, and shipping them. So that's pretty fast for a nuclear facility of that age that's been in standby mode or storage mode for a very long time. And so we are pretty proud of how fast we got this moving. But you can expect to see all that material gone by June, 100%. Right now we're 57% complete. Meanwhile, we're also planning these cusp shipments, the direct disposal element of that direct disposition campaign, and we've made some real good progress. There's still some risk here I'll talk about, but we feel confident that these shipments will be going in 13. And we went forward with that phase 2 analysis that the Deputy Secretary wanted us to do. In fact, I just published an internal review draft last night, and so I'm going to give you guys the first glimpse of the results of that today. So some of the preliminary phase 2 conclusions, and I call them preliminary because it's just a review draft. It's out for technical review. It's not really for public consumption yet. It hasn't been shown to headquarters, for example, or approved. But this is what we're concluding in the phase 2. First thing we wanted to do was take another look at direct disposition, because that's the cheapest, easiest route to get the material off site. And we looked hard at other programmatic needs, and we looked hard at other opportunities for direct disposal. It turns out that if we pushed it, we could send 22 other canisters called the thorium return cans out to Nevada for direct disposal if we really wanted to. But when we looked at the risk associated with that, because of the quality of the analytical data associated with those canisters, we felt like we'd be pushing things, and we could end up putting a lot of effort in and ultimately getting these rejected. And if that were the case, we'd waste a lot of money, and it doesn't cost us that much just to add those 22 back into the processing mix.
So what percentage would you say would be the risk was in terms of rejection? All 22 or 50%?
Yeah, well, they're all 22 would be the same. They would have the same fate because they all have the same history.
Okay.
But the concern was that the process knowledge that we would use to characterize them could possibly be interpreted as inadequate, and they might require sampling. And once you open the canisters, it's just as easy to process as it is to sample. So we decided that we'd just go ahead and process those instead.
Excuse me, so the risk piece is not human health? This is
No,
the risk of
project risk.
Project risk.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll try and clarify that because I tend to mix that. I'll make sure I talk when I'm talking about human health risk. I'll make sure I note that. And then the other thing that we concluded is that we have an opportunity here to help out NNSA. NNSA has commissioned a study by ORNL. NNSA is the National Nuclear Security Agency. They asked ORNL to look at the situation nationally with certified reference material. Now this is going to get complex, but uranium-233 can be used in small quantities as a certified reference material in analytical laboratory applications, such as measurements of tiny quantities of fissile material for proliferation purposes. So NNSA has an interest in preserving some of the highest purity U-233 that we have. And rather than have it accidentally get downblended, we have an opportunity to work in concert with ORNL and save some of this material for that application. So we're going to squeeze an interim campaign of 9 additional canisters in between our zipper plate shipments to the DAF and our cusp shipments to the landfill in Nevada. And those 8 or 9 canisters are going to go to ORNL, where they will qualify them as certified reference material for NNSA, and they will go from there to some strategic reserve location, probably the device assembly facility in Nevada, just like the zipper plates. So that's the next step. That was also a product of the Phase 2 effort. And the other thing that we're going to do is for the remaining canisters that are of interest to other DOE programs, we're going to send these out as we run into them during the processing phase. So the total programmatic transfers have 3 stages. Zipper plates now, which will be done in June, this interim campaign of 9 canisters that will go to ORNL, and the third stage are some canisters, the remaining canisters of interest to NNSA for certified reference material, and then a batch that the test readiness program in NNSA wants out at the DAF facility also. But rather than get those now, since there's no urgency, we're going to pluck them out of the inventory as we get into the processing phase, set them aside, and then do one campaign for efficiency's sake during the processing and get them out to Nevada. So that's sort of the plan now. It's really cemented well and solidified well in Phase 2 for getting rid of the items of program interest. Now, when it comes to the processing piece, which applies to the second half of the inventory that's really ineligible for a direct disposition, we abandoned the idea of, so far, at least preliminarily, of using Building 3019 for anything except extraction and storage, because it is just too expensive to try and retrofit that facility. Instead, we are proposing to use a building that is currently owned by the Office of Science, right across the street. It's actually visible in that photograph, across the street from Building 3019. It's called Building 2026. And we're proposing to use that facility. It's an existing hot cell facility. It actually has done work very similar to this in the past, including the dissolution of fissile materials. They've got 4 beautiful hot cells that we can use. It's not got any programmatic needs within the Office of Science. It was literally sitting there in standby mode and sort of waiting to be transferred from the Office of Science. I think I just turned this off. No, I didn't. Okay, from the Office of Science to EM for D&D anyway. So EM is going to take a little bit earlier ownership of that facility and utilize it now for processing of uranium-233 if headquarters and my own line management agree with the conclusions of Phase 2. I'll show you why it's a compelling argument in a moment when I throw the figures up.
And how long will that be in operation?
If it's approved, I'll show you the timeline.
Okay.
In fact, I have a whole timeline set out, and you'll see the answer right there, if you can hold on for just a moment. So what we would still do is we would use Building 2026 instead of 3019 to dissolve the remaining inventory, downblend it with depleted uranium, and then just like the Phase 1 suggested, we will take that, truck it over to the TWPC, where it will be co-processed with the sludges and solidified for disposal in Nevada. So we're using a piece of the Phase 1, but we're kind of taking the savings to another level with the Phase 2 by abandoning 3019 for processing and using 2026 instead. Okay? Now, the other thing I should point out, because this has been of concern to some folks, we have a batch of depleted uranium that we got transferred to us from Savannah River in anticipation of the need to downblend this material, to downblend the entire inventory. Well, now that we're only going to downblend half the inventory, we have about twice as much as we need. So the proposed approach involves direct disposal of the remaining unused depleted uranium out in Nevada. So we've included that cost in our analysis. So here's the timeline that you asked for. Now again, this is tentative. It requires endorsement at headquarters. It also requires, by the way, some predictable $35 to $45 million in annual funding, and that's not out of range of what we should expect, because we, for example, this year we're funded at $37 million, which is right smack in that range. So we're hoping that we continue to get that kind of support all the way through the life cycle of the project,
which would be FY18. So our timeline looks like this. We're going to complete the zipper shipments in June of 2012. We'll do that. We'll insert that little interim transfer campaign of the material, the 9 canisters to ORNL in August. We'll complete the cusp shipments in August of 2014. That's the ones that are going to the landfill in Nevada. Hopefully we'll get billing 2026 cleaned out this year or beginning this year and ending in FY13 because we need that to get rolling so that we can so that we have enough time to do our what little modifications and insertion of processing equipment into billing 2026 so that we can roll directly from the cusp shipments into processing without a delay. So that would be the idea is do a little bit of 2026 clean out starting this year and into next year, and then do the process design in 2026 and conclude it in 13, and then do the modifications to 2026 and 14, and then process between FY15 and 17. There's your answer.
On 2026, the clean out and the process design for 12 and 13, is there a budget, project budget? For
Not yet. We're finding the mechanism to do that. We're looking for it right now. So.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Modern MSRE trap, are they including that processing fiscal year 15 to 17?
Yes, the MSRE traps would go in here as well.
They're UF6, right?
Yes, and so what we have to do with those is the canisters have to be vented, and the potential fluorine gas in the headspace has to be captured in a canister that they'll be vented into, and then we dump the sodium fluoride pellets out into a tray, dissolve it with the uranium, precipitate out, I can't remember what gets precipitated, but we precipitate out a component of it, and then the dissolved uranium gets downblended just like the other dissolved uranium. You look like you have questions there.
Well, it's just maybe 10 years ago, the conversion project, but now very successful. Trying to convert the UF6 to U3O8.
Yeah, we're not going to bake it. We're not going to bake it into that. We're going to literally just vent the containers and dissolve the whole batch in concentrated nitric. Yeah, they were going to oxidize that with a muffle furnace, and we've decided not to go down that route. So there's a piece of it that's going to hang out into FY18, and that's going to be that excess depleted uranium disposal. And then we're going to have to go back in and stabilize billing 2026 and 3019 once they're emptied out of the inventory for future D&D. Now, this is right out of the review draft phase 2, chapter 4, conclusion. And so you're the first people that have seen this, pretty much. So it's very much raw and rough, but I think these numbers are going to hold up. We have a pretty detailed estimate behind, fairly detailed for this level of analysis. Our original approach, you may recall, for those of you who were here a year ago when I did this presentation, the phase 1 recommendation that involved billing 3019 dissolution and downblending and then use of TWPC for co-processing. I projected $110 million in savings over the original approach. That analysis assumed that both techniques were funded in an unconstrained manner, that we got as much money we needed in every year as we needed it. And in some cases, it would peak out well above $50 million in the phase 1. And in the original approach, even more than that. Here, in the phase 2, we did something that was a little bit more precise. In the phase 2, we assumed a much more realistic funding level of $40 million a year. And when you do that, the original approach gets ridiculously expensive because what happens is when you're inadequately funding a major construction job like 3019 modification and the associated annex would have been, when you're underfunding that, you stretch out the construction schedule and you injure your construction logic, and so that exacerbates the issue. And as you begin to stretch the project out, the fixed costs inside of billing 3019 of safe and secure storage start eating out a greater and greater percentage of your annual funding. And so you have a diminishing return for the variable costs that you have left to spend. And so it stretches out further and further and further. and the cost grows like this, and you end up with a $1.1 billion life cycle price tag. Now that includes the sunk cost prior to FY12 of about $241 million in this case. So there's a very large price tag to the original approach. And then when you do an apples-to-apples comparison to the preferred Phase 1 approach, the one I just described, you see a savings of about $240 million, but it's still a pretty high price tag. Then if you look at the Phase 2 approach, and the Phase 2 approach now includes dissolution and downblending in 2026 as opposed to billing 3019, it's way cheaper, because we avoid the entire capital construction aspect of this. Billing 2026, even its ventilation systems look quite capable of supporting this scope of work. Billing 3019, modifications would have been very substantial, including the construction of a new hot cell. Even though the hot cells are robust, none of them have manipulators. So they would have had to have a whole new hot cell constructed over an old hot cell, all the ventilation systems upgraded, a whole new annex built, and you can see why it's a major construction job. 2026 doesn't have any of that. And so really what you're doing is you're retrieving canisters, you're running them one can at a time over to billing 2026, and you're processing small quantities so that you're below criticality safety concerns at any given time. So you're not having to upgrade the systems to be in criticality safe. You're doing it in a very slow, methodical, small quantity manner, but you can still get it done in 3 years since we're only dealing with half the inventory. So the cost savings is gigantic, and so the argument becomes quite convincing to folks up in the headquarters.
Now, the other half of that inventory, I think you said we would ship off, and this is the inventory of the material that we received from Savannah River. Is that correct?
No. You're mixing apples and oranges there. The inventory you're talking about from Savannah River is just raw material for use as a diluent.
Okay.
The depleted uranium to dilute this material. The first half of the uranium-233 inventory goes two different routes. One is, they're both in Nevada, though. One is to a storage facility for future programmatic use of NNSA's Criticality Safety Program and Test Readiness Program. And the other route is to the Nevada landfill. And that's half the inventory. And that's all out of here by August of 2014. And so you're only left with 530 or so canisters that have to go down this route, this post direct disposition campaign route. So from here down, basically.
When do you see getting an answer to whether or not there's agreement that we're going to be doing?
I think within a month. I think we're going to try and get it, a month to 2 months. I'm going to try and publish a final draft by the end of April and be in headquarters pitching it in May.
I'm sorry, I'm
Yes.
kind of slow. Is that a cost for the 3019 modification, $1 million, is that conservative or not conservative?
It's actually, all of these numbers are considered relatively conservative.
Okay.
Yeah, and there just isn't much modification because, again, all we're doing in 3019 is extracting canisters just like we're already doing for the zipper plates. And the only real modifications that we're talking about, I think we might have had some minor modifications to the shielded transfer cask that we'll need to use to get them from 3019 to 2026. Not a whole lot else.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there are probably no routine monitoring inspection at 39, no routine, but there's
Right.
some kind of inspection. So the inventory quite accurate?
Yes, the inventory, of course, the inventory has to
They
be.
don't have a routine inspection,
No.
something change or?
No, there isn't a routine. In fact, the facility currently enjoys a waiver from the Nuclear Material Control and Accountability requirements for annual inventory. And the reason for that waiver is because of how difficult it is to get in and out of that vault. It's extremely expensive. There's no way anybody can screw around with it when it's in that vault. So in headquarters, they're convinced it's safe without that annual inventory. So we do not do an inventory. It will be inventoried on the way out, though, and reconfirmed. But when it went into storage, there was a thorough inventory made. And so we do have, of course, a pretty thorough spreadsheet that shows every single can, what its expected contents and dose are and all that, and its labels and all that kind of thing.
cleanup of environmental hazards at the Department of Energy's Oak Ridge site is an issue that affects us all. DOE is working to address the issue, but it needs citizen input. One way you can help is to take part in the meetings of the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board, a volunteer citizens panel. By attending meetings, you can learn about the cleanup program and voice your opinions. Join us in making our area an even better place to live. For more information, call toll-free or visit us online.